Welcome back, everyone. We are now doing the panel on how to invest in Nordic Life Science innovation and discuss the sector in general. With me, I have Roger Franklin from Hadean. I have Viktor Drvota from Karolinska Development and Niclas Holmberg from Nasdaq. Perhaps if we could start with you, Niclas, could you please make an introduction to yourself and your experience?
Yes, in my day-to-day job, I'm responsible for the company listed on our regulated market, Nasdaq First North, our growth market. And for sure, we will come back to that, but also the healthcare sector is the most important sector for Nasdaq. And also beside that, I'm part of the advisory board for EIT Healthcare Catapult Program.
Thank you.
Okay, Viktor Drvota is my name. I am the CEO of Karolinska Development. I've been in venture capital in life science for almost 20 years. Before that, I was an associate professor in cardiology at the Karolinska University Hospital.
And I'm Roger Franklin. I'm a partner at Hadean Ventures based here in Stockholm. We're venture capital funds focused on the life sciences based in Oslo and Norway. And we recently raised the first close of our second fund. So we'll be investing that over the next few years. And we focus mostly on the Nordic region, but also on the DACH region as well. So make investments across Europe. My personal background is originally in oncology. That's where I did my PhD. And then for the last 15 years, I've worked in investment banking, strategy consulting, venture capital, the last 3 years of which have been here in the Nordic region.
Thank you. You all have very fitting backgrounds and experience for this panel, obviously. So today we have heard some very interesting presentations from innovative Nordic companies in the life science segment. And I don't know if you heard my opening address, but I said that some of the companies here are really leaders in their specific space. And that has really been proven during the day. So it's I'm very proud to have been presenting these companies, of course. It also struck me that quite a few of the CEOs of the companies weren't actually Swedish. It's quite a diverse selection with people from Denmark, which was perhaps not so unexpected, but UK, Canada, New Zealand. So it's the foreigners were kind of overrepresented compared to from what at least I expected. So that's also an interesting detail I wasn't aware of before today's event. We have a large portion of research funds that are going into research are going into the life science sector in the Nordic region. And also there's a big share of the companies listed on the Nasdaq. I don't think there are in the space. I don't think there's another stock market in the entire world that has the same proportion. Niclas, perhaps do you have a clue of how many life science related, including medtech and so on, how many companies there are listed now?
Yeah, first David, a comment on your intro regarding the non-Nordic companies and the interest from Nordic investors. We see every day that companies, advisors and investors would like to figure out how can we be part of this fantastic ecosystem that we have here in Sweden, and especially with the healthcare. So I can just add to that, that is something that we feel, growing from day to day. In terms of number of companies in the Nordic, within the healthcare space, is 200. And it's around 50% on the regulated market on Nasdaq First North. And so far this year, we have listed 21 companies. So what really stands out is the possibility for early stage company to be able to raise capital in the public market. So, and for the rest of the year and the next year, the pipeline looks extremely strong.
Thank you for that, Niclas. And moving over to Viktor, what are the first things you look at when evaluating a new company that you might potentially invest in?
I mean, it's of course the management if they have done it before. That rarely happens, but we see some entrepreneurs who come back with new companies. But that's really, and also, I mean, have they done specifically this before? If they haven't, we try to find people to support them that have. And of course, I mean, if we look at look at the science, etc., that's really important. We really would like to see top class science, and not too early. I mean, at Karolinska Development, way back, we did the mistake in investing too early, and it's very difficult to actually make money if you invest too early. So, strategy we have now is that within therapeutics, that we should have around 3 years to a phase 2A readout, which means that you will have to be in late preclinic going into phase 1. So that's, and then in medtech and all the other sectors, we're looking for turnover. Companies must have turnover, must have customers and reimbursement, preferably within the medtech. Otherwise, it's a very long journey. I've done several investments previously where, you know, it's just a very, very long journey. Within medtech, the perceived risk is lower, but it's not. It's actually at least as high, but it's a different type of risk. It's a market risk. Instead of a biological execution risk, you have a market risk there as well. So, I mean, and I think it's even harder to do exits in medtech than in therapeutics. So I think there are numbers showing that it's about twice as likely to do a good exit in therapeutics than you have in medtech. So, I mean, that's also steers where we're putting our money. It's mostly into therapeutics, and then some part of it goes into medtech.
Mm. And Roger, how about you? What do you look at?
Yeah, and I think all the things that Viktor said are things that we look at, obviously, as well. And I agree also with the comments about the balance between therapeutics and medtech. I think, are relatively unusual in European life science venture fund, in that we do still look at medtech. Many funds have started to focus exclusively on therapeutics for exactly the reasons that Viktor's just said. But I think that from our standpoint, that has moved to such an extreme that actually there are some quite interesting opportunities in medtech if you're selective. So that's certainly something we look at, and we did I think two or three medtech investments out of the first fund. So we're certainly willing to deploy in that area. But yeah, I think the same things that I think a lot of investors are looking for in terms of team, technology, market opportunity, underlying kind of operational capability within the team, not just at the C level. And I think one specific aspect for us is, really robust preclinical data sets and any evidence of clinical de-risking or the ability to translate from preclinical data into clinical data. That's absolutely critical for us. We spend a lot of time looking at preclinical data and the translatability of those models. And I think that's something where we see a lot of, that's where it's easy for companies to shortcut. In the race to the clinic, there's often a tendency to kind of skimp on some of the preclinical work, and that's something that we won't back. So we spend a lot of time looking at that.
Mm-hmm. And do you include diagnostics in medtech, or would that be a separate story?
We do also invest in diagnostics, and we have made investments in the diagnostic space.
But do you consider it as risky as medtech in general, or is that less or more? I mean, diagnostics specifically.
I can comment. We rarely do diagnostics. There's a good reason for it. It's even tougher than medtech to get out, and the deals you do are usually not as good as in medtech, so that's even tougher. So I mean, diagnostic, yes, but very rarely. I mean, that's a really difficult space to be in.
I see. Thank you. And looking at the valuations, so we often see companies in the Nordics and Sweden trade at lower multiples or valuations compared to where they are in their research stage as compared to the similar companies in the US. Why do you think that is, Viktor?
I mean, if you look at Nasdaq First North, there's a lot of companies who are clinical stage or valued. I mean, I think entering phase 2, I think it's like $30-ish million. That's really cheap if you look at from an international perspective. I mean, when we talk to international investors, I mean, when we say 300 million SEK, they think we mean euros or dollars. So, I mean, it's sometimes. So, I think there are opportunities at First North where many of the companies are quite cheap. But I think there are so many companies now, and it's very hard to differentiate for a retail investor. How can you differentiate? So so I think the key for these companies is to get a deal, an external validation with someone, a pharma company, actually showing, well, there is someone else than the retail investors believing in this. So, but yes, there is a discrepancy, and I think, I mean, we talk to investors in Hong Kong, we talk to investors in various from various European countries and US, and yes, it's cheap. And sometimes the investor doesn't understand that it's how cheap it is, and they think we actually met investors who thought this is fishy. This is too cheap.
Yeah, there must be something wrong. Yeah,
there must be something wrong. Exactly.
Niclas, what would you like to add to that?
No, I think it's quite interesting to remember Cellink, now renamed Bico, and I rang the bell with them 2016 in November with a pre-money valuation 12 million euro, raising 3 million euro. And a company like that will never have access to the public market in other countries. And they have a clear strategy why they wanted to go public with Nasdaq and go into US. And now they have gone back to the market 7-8 times, made a lot of acquisition, and they are a 3 billion euro company right now. So again, maybe you need to accept, at least in the public market, that valuation is low, is very high risk in the beginning. But you're part of a growth journey. And we meet many healthcare companies that have been at a conference in US, and they talk to some sales guys, and they say, oh, we should go to the US market. What do you think about that, Niclas? Yeah, trust me, do a really serious research, because it costs a lot of money, and you need to really figure out if the investors actually are there. But of course, it's a broader market. You have access to more capital and more specialized funds. And we will be happy to support company in the healthcare space to do a listing like Karolinska did 1 year ago.
I think the other thing is that the nature of the market here is that because of on a relative basis to the US, there's obviously much less venture capital available. And so, an early public listing is an alternative financing route. And, you're really comparing companies that are in financing mode, are doing the equivalent of, a Series A financing versus companies in the US where those are really exits. And so it's not in a way, a like-for-like comparison. And, if you compare the valuations on the junior market in Sweden or other Nordic markets with valuations in the private markets at Series A, okay, then you're looking more comparable in terms of where the valuations sit.
Interesting.
And I think also that you have to look at it from another perspective. I mean, it's a lot of volatility in this. The liquidity is slow, so it's a financing event. I tell the CEOs just to forget about the share price for a while. Yeah. Focus on your business, and there will be what we call share flippers. I mean, day traders going in and out, especially on the small lists where you see they can push the price up many percent, and then it goes down. And one thing that usually happens is that you have a really good event, maybe a positive phase 2 study or something, and the share goes down. So, and that's the retail traders who say all of a sudden it's a big liquidity, you can get out. And so I think that is a problem that we have, and how do we mitigate that? But I think that's sort of the nature of the game, where we have low liquidity stocks on small markets, but you have to just forget about the share price and focus on what you're doing.
But also the fact that you don't have maybe so much that you can communicate to the market until you get the result from FDA. So it's a little bit of, okay, how could I keep my investors happy and curious about our share when I don't have that much to communicate? So that is a challenge.
I mean, there certainly are opportunities, like you said, there certainly are. There's a lot of companies out there at relatively low valuations, and there are opportunities there. And I think it's, you know, we're I guess pretty unusual as a venture fund that we do invest in public companies. Not, you know, we don't. It's not a big part of our portfolio, but we do it. And that's partly a reflection of the fact that there is an opportunity to do that here. I mean, we wouldn't be doing that if we were based in Germany or the US or UK.
So yeah, it's an interesting ecosystem, and the reasons behind it are pretty logical. My view is that this is not going to change anytime soon. It's going to go on the way as it is. Does anyone have a different view?
Yes, I do. I think once the market goes sour, I mean, the first thing that investors take away money from is these high-risk investments, and there will be, I think, I mean, depending on what happens in the world economy, and don't forget that the stock exchange have been going up for how many years? 13, I think it's the record during the past 100 years or something. There will be a correction, and when that correction comes, I think assets will go into much safer things than early-stage life science companies.
I totally agree in terms of professional institutional investors, but I think the dynamic amount Avanza Nordnet investors, that's a little bit
They are very
they are quite they are prepared to take a risk.
Yeah.
I mean, we're already starting to see this in the US markets. I mean, the US markets obviously were, you know, have been very hot throughout the whole COVID period, are much less so now. IPOs are getting done, but only when they're 100% covered by internal investors. You know, it's got a lot tougher in the US, and, you know, in past cycles that has spread out from the US to other markets, so I'd expect the same thing to happen again. And I think to some extent, you know, a lot is going to depend on the current crop of companies, whether they deliver. You know, there was if you look back to what happened in the AIM market in the UK back in the early 2000s, you know, there were a whole crop of companies that went public, and, you know, that market ultimately fell down because most of those companies didn't execute. And, you know, we'll have to see whether the current crop of companies here execute and deliver, in which case it'll continue to be a buoyant market, or they don't, in which case we'll see a development as we did in the UK in the early 2000s.
So we need some success stories to drive the hope of investors, to make them want to take risk and drive prices up.
But I think there are success stories.
There are.
So
Are there
don't
enough?
forget, I think it's of course sometimes it's a minor risk, but there's a lot of success stories actually. So you know.
No, I totally agree, but also the fact that if too high number of early stage company that fail, that will be harder for the next company. So that I would say what's happened 2017. In the end, it was, you know, tougher to raise capital. You try to, you know, make it through guarantees or special agreements, and so in the end, it was a few companies that maybe should not have go public. They should instead cancel it and try to finance it in the private world instead. But again, now we're going to go for a record year. We have 110 companies listed so far in Sweden. And our pipeline is extremely strong, but you have a combination of high valuation, so you have the PE companies going public, but also new technologies within clean tech, fintech, to add to low interest rates, so you can also add real estate companies. So actually it's a market that almost cover all the sectors. But we see there's a gap within. When I go to Lund and do IPO workshop, it's still they're a little bit worried that the smart capital, like you guys represent, is not enough.
Yeah.
So I love to see companies like Link, more of them, so actually retail investors can invest in a company that cover a few more portfolio companies.
Karolinska Development is one of those.
Yeah, you are also.
I think that, I mean, the thing with that is that, I mean, I've yet to visit anywhere in the world where companies say there's enough venture capital available.
Right,
Maybe there is one.
Yeah, I don't know.
So are there any particular fields in life science that are of particular interest to you right now, where you're looking for new opportunities? How about you, Roger? You want to start?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that we're, you know, the thesis of our fund is more about the misallocation of venture capital, you know, on a global level, and therefore the focus on particular regions. So as a matter of investment thesis, we don't focus on particular top-down themes of we'd like to invest in cell therapy or we'd like to invest in whatever. Just to say that. Of course, there are things that we find interesting thematically. I think one area that we are interested in is kind of cell therapy platforms, in particular areas, particularly around allogeneic cell therapy. So that's something that we've looked at a lot. I think there's a lot of interesting innovation in hematology. So we're looking at a number of hematology deals, or have done over the last year, and are looking at further deals in that space, particularly as it relates to hematology and the kind of latest modalities in terms of engineered antibody platforms. And then I think there's some interesting emerging stuff going on in CNS. So that's an area, CNS and cardiovascular, I guess, are two areas which, have been out of fashion in venture for, quite a long time. And I think there are some interesting changes there, both on the fundamental science level and also in terms of the ability to target certain kind of rare forms of cardiovascular diseases, which are attracting a lot of interest. So we're looking there as well. And I think that fits into also to a general theme, I think, in the industry that there's been a huge amount of focus on oncology, huge amount of cash has gone into oncology. There are some changes with regard to the structure of the US market that I think mean that specialty drug pricing is, may on a relative basis come under pressure relative to primary care drug pricing. And so there's just a bit of a shift in terms of focus, I think, a little bit away from oncology, which was a huge focus, and towards other areas. And cardiovascular, I think, is one where that is certainly we're seeing, and we're looking at lots of opportunities in.
And is it fair to say also that the way the capital flows in that area, you will see many new companies and innovations? So has that oncology was kind of in fashion, made this kind of the research society come up with a lot of new companies within that field? Or would you say that there is no connection really there, causality?
I mean, one would like to think that academic funding is directed to where the best projects are, right? And then that the money flows to where the best projects are in an ideal world. Of course, it's not an ideal world, and I think there probably are more oncology startups than there would be had there not been such a kind of gold rush in terms of funding. So will that mitigate to some extent? Probably. But I think there's still going to be, oncology is still going to represent a big chunk of the industry, simply because there's a lot of innovation going on in there. But I think it's the reality of a few years ago where there were certain spaces where it was very, very hard to raise any money in venture, from a venture capital fund. So respiratory or the kind of larger chunks of cardiovascular, like heart failure and so on. That was very, very challenging. I think it's becoming less challenging.
I see. And what about you, Viktor? Specific areas of interest?
Well, I mean, we are looking at immune therapy outside of the oncology space. I think that could be interesting. We invested in a company called SVF, which is immune therapy towards hepatitis, or curative hepatitis D and B. And that's sort of an innovative way of looking at immune therapy instead of doing it in oncology. Biomaterials is also something that could be is of interest for us, absolutely. And I think, looking forward, there will be a lot of more genome-wide association-based therapies, i.e., which we call precision medicine. That is starting in oncology. That will be eventually go into other areas as well, where you can tailor more to tailor the medicines more towards depending on diagnostics. Compliance is also one area that's been of interest to us. So many medicines are actually quite effective. The key thing is that patients doesn't take them, and also compliance within healthcare sector. Do the hospital actually do according to the rights and to the standards? And most of the times they don't. And if they do, not most of the times, but many times they don't. If they do, they can actually increase the results much, much more than if you add a new drug, for example. So those are areas that are except that what Roger is saying is we're looking at those kind of things as well. But and of course, orphan drug has been very, very hot for a while. But we're looking also in other fields. Women's health, for example, becoming more popular. We have 2 companies within women's health, and I think we see a lot of interest now in women's health. I mean, Organon, for example, which was set up just to focus on women's health. So, I mean, there are things that are very interesting. But if you look from a societal perspective, you should actually be looking at pain and psychiatry, because those 2 really big unmet medical needs.
And what about, just a brief follow-up, you said biomaterials?
Yeah, for example, we have a company called OsDesign, and it's an implant which acts as a scaffold for bone cells, and then the material dissolves and you end up with actually having formed bone. But you can, I mean, so that's one example of biomaterials, which is interesting. So regenerative medicine, usually you have to build scaffolds where the cell can climb, and then the scaffold disappear, and you have a new tissue. But of course, I mean, still you can't build complicated tissues. You can't build a heart, but you can build simpler tissues like bone and something like that. Yeah.
And Niclas, is there some, you mentioned earlier, if I understood you correctly, that it's kind of the listings and fundraisings are basically all over the place. There's no few specific areas which are more dominant than others.
Not what we can see right now, but again, I covered all the sectors. So I'm sitting here and listen to Roger and Viktor and try to catch up as much knowledge as possible. But as you mentioned, the new technology. So I was actually gonna, hope that you should not mention that sector, because again, I see so when you go to Uppsala and visit some labs, new technology, new material, and of course that will in the future be possible to use that in the healthcare sector as well. So.
Okay, I would now like to move on to my next question. And Roger, if I may start with you again. Are there any areas within life science that you feel have unjustly been named graveyard with, of course, difficulty to attract capital?
Yes.
Please do mention one or 2.
So, I mean, there are some obvious ones like, stroke, for example, is an area that, or certainly neuroprotection in stroke is an example of an area that is kind of often held up as being a graveyard. I think lots of cardiovascular indications have been, in heart failure I mentioned, have been, that's been an area of a lot of failures historically. And I think some of those are unfair. So I think there are some indications where, because the end, actually Alzheimer's of course is another example, where the end opportunity is so massive that the industry's been kind of rolling the dice a lot on projects with low probabilities of success, and that's generated a kind of long history of failures. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be, those history of failures are going to continue, because science changes, things move on, and new technologies emerge, and you can, as an example, there are, I think, interesting things going on in stroke that now may mean that we may see some successes in stroke.
Same for Alzheimer, I hope.
Yes.
Maybe.
I thought I'll stay clear of commenting on anything that's happened in Alzheimer's recently, but yes, potentially.
Yeah. Viktor?
Yeah, I mean, except for the ones Roger mentioned, I mean, there are septic shock, for example. That's a big area. I mean, you can treat a bacterial infection, but you can't treat immunological infection actually kills you. And it's a big thing in the industrialized world. It's 700,000 patients every year that dies from septic shock in the US. So, and that's totally undeserved. I mean, that's much bigger than most of the cancer forms and many of the cancer forms together. So, I mean, why don't we have more research on that? Because, yes, it's been difficult. It's been a graveyard as well, except for the areas that but also, psychiatry and CNS is also something that's been difficult, and it's been difficult to bring forth new drugs. But I think, I mean, as we go along and learn more about CNS with all the new diagnostics methods that we have, I think we will see more coming out in that area.
Great, thank you. Let's say normally it takes 12 to 15 years for a new drug to reach the market. But if you use Sprint, it will of course go Sprint Bioscience, it will be a lot quicker. So what are the most important factors you believe for a company to complete this process and being able to capitalize on their innovation? Viktor, I'll go with you first this time.
I mean, so it's a journey into no man's land in essence. You do something that nobody has done before if you are first in class or if you have a new device, which means that there will be very surprising things happening to you during that journey, which means that you have to have a management that is flexible enough to go to the left if left is needed, and tomorrow go to the right if that's needed, because there will be surprises that will happen. And I think that's the key thing. And then also, if you look at companies as they develop, you probably have to change management. You maybe start with from the academia, maybe even the researcher as a CEO or the founder, and then you switch on to more professional people, and then when the company grows, and then even more professional people. I think within medtech that's most clear, because there you start from doing the early studies, that's much more scientific, and then you go into market, that's a totally different skill set, and then you go international, which again requires another skill set. So usually there are CEO transitions, but I think most of the time it's all about the people, if you succeed or not. It's very important that you have the right people, and what we do is that we look at the companies and we try to find people who have done exactly this before. So if you are in a bone graft company, you would like to have people who have done exactly that journey and sold that company to some big company. Not somebody who's in general medtech. I don't buy that. That's too wide. You have to have people who knows all the pitfalls within that specific narrow area.
That's
really
a big
important
box to check if you can find those people.
Yeah, well, usually that's why you don't stay in Sweden, right? So you have to go abroad to find either CEOs or advisors or board members or what have you. But that's I think one of the key things here if you want your company to succeed. And then of course to have good investors. That's always good, right? That can help you on that journey.
Would you like to add something to that, Roger?
I think one thing, just in your question, you mentioned the timelines, and obviously that, I think it's true that drug development is a long journey, but I think we should also remember that, with the way things have changed, with certain indications, with selected patient populations, with, truncated paths to approval, often that it can be much shorter than that. And I think Roche took Zelboraf from IND to approval in 5 years. It's possible to shrink those timelines, but you have to think in an innovative and, as Viktor says, flexible way. You're going to hit roadblocks, and you need to think out of the box in terms of how you design your studies to de-risk the next stage as much as possible, as fast as possible, in as capital efficient manner as possible. And if you do that, which you will only do if you have people who know what they're doing, which, as Viktor says, means people who've largely done it before, then you have a good chance. But if you learn on the job during those 15 years, then it's going to be a challenging 15 years and expensive.
Yeah, from a shareholder perspective, there's going to be a lot more value preserved if someone goes walks a path that they have walked before, for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. And for the companies watching today that are not yet public, Niclas, would you do your kind of short pitch version? What they need to do, what they need to have in order when they come and visit you?
Yes, we host quite many IPO workshops, and almost every day we meet companies in the private world that consider the public market. And one thing, you remember the management, you always look into the management. Another thing is the board members. I know many investors that maybe not know that much about biotech or life science or what that could be, but when they see 1, 2 board members, they are prepared to invest in that company because he had been successful before, so they follow that. So to pimp the board members, but also the fact that you need to know your best friends, your shareholders. So you are going maybe from 3, 4 investors to a huge number of investors. So you need to understand who are they. Are they just retail investors? Do you which one going to sit with you if your result will not be, your quarterly report is not successful, you are delayed with something? Then you should have a quite good picture. Okay, who will buy more shares when the share price drop? Because they believe in you. So if you are a few months late, it's fine with them. So I think you more early you're more unpredictable your road in terms of revenue, in terms of success. You need to be closer to your investors. If you deliver on the last row, the numbers talk for itself.
Yeah, good point there. Okay, so back to investment strategies. Viktor, I'm going to start with you. You said this is a question about when you would like to invest, and you were pretty clear that don't want to invest too early. So are we talking proof of concept or even later, or like?
I mean, how do you define proof of concept? In my world, proof of concept is phase 2. Data readout, that's proof of concept. Before that, you don't know if it, and that's an indication of proof of concept, I would argue, not really proof of concept, because that's phase 3. So, and I mean, where can we afford with our funds to invest? So it's usually taking it from, as Roger said, somewhere late pre-clinic and translate that into some kind of clinical data, usually phase 2, and then try to sell it. And the nice thing about, for example, orphan indication is that with your syndicate, you can potentially take it all the way, as, for example, in cardiovascular, if you're going to do, heart failure trial, phase 3, that's like $300 million or something. So, that Amgen can do that. We can't do that. So, I mean, so you have to really be aware about that when you do those big indications, that you can actually end up in something what we call the phase 2 trap. I mean, nobody really wants to buy it. What do you do? Maybe you can list it and raise the money on the stock exchange. But I mean, that's really important for us. And yeah.
And Roger, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. For us, when we look at stage, I guess we do a variety of deals in terms of stage, but I guess the sweet spot is kind of late preclinical in terms of stage, and the reason is exactly as Viktor says, is to that one, you have enough data to analyze the problem and the asset, and 2, you have enough capital around the table to take the asset to a point at which you have a significant value inflection and ability to sell the company or sell the asset or IPO the company or whatever. One thing that is also an important dynamic there is not just the stage, but also the ask of the company in terms of the capital. We want to have enough capital around the table at the time of our investment to take the company to that point. We don't want to be funding companies for the next year, then wait to see if we can get other investors interested and then fund for another year and so on. Because, we already operate in an industry where there's a lot of risk. You don't need to add a lot of voluntary risk of can we persuade our colleagues that this is a great company. So having money around the table is critical.
I see. Thank you. Okay, we are running out of time, or we actually passed time, but I would still like to conclude with one final question. So this is more, looking into the crystal ball, really. So like 1 or 2 fields within life science that will impact our daily lives the most, or where we could see the most drastic innovations in the next 10 years from now. And you can really go crazy here. Will it be nanobots or whatever, just from your gut? Niclas, do you want to have a stab at this, or is it too?
Your expert area, right?
It's just a huge wish that so many of these 21 companies that have been listed so far within the healthcare space have, become strong players, have been able to, hire new employees, new products. So that is one thing, but also to see companies like Karolinska, be successful, be able to raise more capital and continue to invest in growth company. And because I think that type of shares is so suitable for retail investors, rather maybe sometimes to do the stock picking themselves.
Thank you, Niclas. And Viktor, what would you say?
Oh, it's a crystal ball, but I think what we see now, if we look at, I think one interesting thing to look at is all the devices and gadgets that you probably all wear right now. They measure your heart rate, they measure whatever. I think that is an area that will evolve significantly, and together with that, I mean, you could probably be sitting remotely. The doctor could monitor the patient remotely. You can probably have, as we have meetings right now, I mean, with the doctor on video or over Teams. I think that is going to change healthcare a lot. All the wearables potentially that we have. I mean, from a layman perspective, I think. That's sort of an obvious field, but I think it seems that many people are prepared to put on, for example, a ring like this, who measures everything, essentially. Measures your sleep, it measures your pulse, it measures everything. And I think that's part of the future is, and how to capitalize on that when there are companies doing that today. And that's one thing that we can discuss. There are, of course, many other things. But Roger, before we give you a chance to.
No, I think in the therapeutic space, I think in vivo gene editing is obviously something that's, a huge amount of capital has gone into, is going into, and, will most likely ultimately produce some pretty impressive results in the long term. I think another area is kind of...
I'm sorry, and is that to get rid of hereditary diseases, or...
Or to treat them.
Yeah, to treat them.
To treat them in the not in the germline, but to treat them in patients manifesting those diseases. So I think that's an interesting area, and I think there's a lot of enabling technology that is being developed that will allow those therapies to ultimately jump over the safety hurdles that regulators need to see, and that's the kind of one of the barriers today. But I think as those barriers, are taken away and solved. That's going to have huge impact on human health. And I think another area will be kind of tunable nucleic acid-based therapies. So these are, drugs that can behave in different ways depending on the types of cells that they're in, and that really allows, revolution in terms of accessing therapeutic window and treating diseases that currently are untreatable. So I think those are two areas. But, as a VC, I guess the old adage is, you invest in evolution, not revolution. So we won't be investing in our fund in things that might change the world in 30 years' time.
For one example is, of course, gene and cell therapy. I was doing research in gene and cell therapy in humans, at least in gene therapy, in late 90s. And now this area is evolving. It still has a way to go, but I think it takes 30 years-ish before it's sort of starting to come to the clinic, and you learn a lot during those. I mean, around the corner in clinical medicine is at least 15 years. That's a good thing that don't invest in revolution. That's really hard to make money on.
Okay, and with that remark, we will end today's panel. Thank you very much, each and every one of you, to have been here and shared your wise thoughts with us and the viewers, of course. And to the viewers, I say thank you very much for having joined us this long day. I hope you are a bit more educated now. I hope you will be making a lot better investments, and that you have many great ideas after today's event. So take care. See you soon again. Bye.